4 p.m. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this very important topic today. I will quickly set the context. Yeah, the agenda for today is something extremely important. What we're here to discuss is energy transition in India, and I think given what the last few months have been like with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This is a topic that has been a topic of discussion across boardrooms, across forums, across the country, and not only in India, across the world, actually. Right. And an energy transition as a topic is no longer a distant net zero discussion. And I believe today it is being thought about beyond net zero, right? It's thought about in the context of energy security, across the topic of resilience. And it is now closely linked to how businesses think about resilience, cost, supply security, capital allocation, long-term competitiveness, right? And I am so excited for today's conversation is because we have someone extremely special and who's someone who's actually thought about this topic way beyond it became, just something that everyone was talking about. He's someone who's been talking about it and thinking about it for many years. And that is Mr. Ankit Todi. Ankit is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Mahindra Group. I will very quickly introduce him. Ankit leads sustainability strategy across the Mahindra Group, one of India's most respected and diversified business groups, with presence across automobile, farm, IT, financial services, renewable energy, logistic, hospitals, real estate, and I'm sure I'm definitely missing something or the other here. His role spans group level sustainability strategy, thought leadership, sustainability reporting, disclosures, compliance, green building transitions, and capacity building across the entire group. He also works closely with investors, policymakers, the World Economic Forum, the UNGC, and several other industry associations, while actively engaging with clean tech and startup ecosystem to bring new innovations in the group. I think a lot of us are part of lots of these WhatsApp groups, dedicated towards discussions of climate. And I think, based on my experience, I've seen Ankit is one of the first few people to provide some insights on topics and debates that kind of go on in some of these WhatsApp groups as well. Before Mahindra, Ankit spent around 7 years with Bain and Company, working across strategy, due diligence, and implementation across multiple sectors. And I am so excited to have you on here. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ankit.
Thank you. Thank you, Arushi, for having me and for the kind introduction. Absolute pleasure to be here and absolutely a very important conversation. So I think the more people understand and engage on the subject, the better it is for everyone.
Thank you so much. So, folks, before we get started, just quick housekeeping. What we'll be doing now is it'll be a little bit of back and forth between me and Ankit. We have some questions prepared for him, but I'm sure that from your perspective also, you might have certain questions that might emerge from this conversation. I would urge you to put it in the chat, and I'll try to pick it up and pose it in front of him. That being said, we will dedicate the last 10 minutes to so that you can kind of unmute perhaps and ask Ankit further questions, right? So without much further ado, we'll begin this, right? So Ankit, let's start at the top, right? Everyone's been talking about the Strait of Hormuz closure, right? Tell us your story, right? When you first heard about this happening, where were you? Where were you? What was your first conversation? What was the first thought to your mind? And how did you react to this entire news?
No, absolutely, Arushi. So the reactions often, for us are more at a country level in terms of, how does it impact the country? Because generally, given the diversity of the group and the kind of businesses we are present in, it's the broader economic story of India that would affect us across the board. Now, if you look at India, the way I look at the energy conversation, because most of the Hormuz conversation for India is effectively about the energy conversation. So the way you look at it is there are two broad, let's say, buckets of energy, especially with respect to this conversation. The first bucket is everything to do with electricity. And then the second bucket is is everything in the non-electricity energy form, which is both fuel for transportation is one of the big categories, and the second is fuel for industrial processes. Now, I think the fundamental thing that we understood is that the first was protected. So electricity, India is largely self-dependent. Unfortunately or fortunately, 75% of our power still comes from coal, which is largely domestically sourced. The remaining 25% comes from a variety of renewable sources, which also largely is domestic dependent. So you are a lot more protected from any sort of external volatility and shocks when it comes to the electricity side of things for a large part of it. Now, the other two parts of it, which is transport. Transport sector is where you have very high dependency on both fuel prices, that is both petrol, diesel, but also for aviation purposes and other purposes, etc. There, while over a period of time, we as a country have been able to diversify our sourcing, and what I would call a lot more mitigation measures have been taken. But having said that, you still have a very significant dependency on the Middle East region. So there was no doubt expectation that there would be disruption in this ecosystem, both in the short term, but also some of it in the long term. I think no one could really predict when the war started in terms of how long this will last, because
Hmm.
right from day one we have been under the impression that it could be something which is as low as 24 hours, or it could just go on for pretty much an indefinite phase of time, which is something that we see some sort of a continuous engagement that has been there. So one was relatively more clear that the impact would be more on the transport side of it, which means that the fuel prices will go up at some point of time if this prolongs for a period of time. The second part of it was, as I said, on the energy for non-transport purposes. That was something which I think relative depth of understanding on that subject was still low. So as the disruption started to play out, we realized that there are a lot more fuel types, especially LNG in particular, where there was very high dependency from Qatar in particular, and that in turn led to a lot more disruptions in, let's say, LPG, in a lot of industrial processes, etc. So I think that view and the depth around that view is something that started getting framed over a period of time. So that is one part of the conversation related to energy. The other part of the conversation is obviously the other sides from an operational standpoint. Both as a large group, there are people that work in all parts of the world, including the Middle East. So there is obviously their safety and concerns, which is a very
Yeah.
important consideration. There is also from a business standpoint, you have both supply chain dependency, both imports and exports. So there are certain considerations there. Again, nothing that is disproportionately disruptive, thankfully, but it takes time for you to come to a stage where you can exactly determine what kind of impacts we have. But as I said, I think from a purely sustainability and a country level, I think the biggest conversation was the energy conversation for us.
Yeah, and Ankit, tell us a little more about that, right? When thinking about the energy conversation, and today I'm sure that you speak with other CSOs, CEOs across industries, right? Now, there again, right? How easy or hard was it to find alternatives? How quickly could you solve for it? Right. I think today, and I'll give you some example, right? We've been speaking with certain organizations in Morbi, right? Some tile companies, right? And I think it's and I think that's just like maybe one example, but that was really impacted Morbi entirely, right? So tell us more about what was happening on ground.
No, absolutely. So I think, see, depending on the nature of the sector and how prepared the sector is, the impact was, very different. So thankfully, I think for a lot of the industries where the dependency was a lot more on the electricity side, there I think companies were a bit more protected. But having said that, and if I were to take a manufacturing sector example, let's say within the Mahindra ecosystem, both on the auto and the farm side, we typically are assemblers for a wide variety of components. We buy from more than 2000 suppliers, and all of them come together to, let's say, form a car or a tractor or a truck for that matter. So, there,
Hmm.
even though you may be protected, your entire supply chain may not necessarily be protected. So, there are a lot more cascading impacts that happen across the value chain. But I think from a purely, sustainability point of view, I think there are two parts to this conversation. One is the immediate disruption. Okay, Morbi tiles started getting impacted, tile manufacturing started getting impacted. The paint industry was another example of an industry that
Yeah.
has very high dependency on fuel. So that got impacted. The LPG crisis to some extent, or at least relatively, difficulty in LPG and natural gas availability led to certain challenges in different parts of the ecosystem, both I think in terms of manufacturing, but also in the people side of things. So that
Hmm.
was a lot of these were what I would call in the short term challenges. But if you were to really take a slightly long term view on this subject, then I also see that it has led to some better understanding on the need to focus on energy security as a country. So while I think the conversation around energy security is not new, and we have been talking about it for a long time, but what these kind of incidences do is really accelerate the depth and execution around a few of these things. So I'm going to maybe focus a little bit more on the more long-term implications that coming out of it,
Yeah.
because the short-term tactical, you can't really solve things overnight. You deal with it. You try and find whatever tactical solutions you have and then try and solve it. And the government has done a good job. Industry has done a good job. We internally made sure that we are trying to keep things as smooth as possible across the group, but also not just for our own ecosystem, but also for our supplier ecosystem. So you really needed the entire ecosystem to be stable for things to continue. So there are a lot of short-term tactical measures that you would take in these kind of situations, but I think the important conversation still is the long-term or mid to long-term conversation. So if I were to just focus on that a little bit, the entire sustainability conversation for energy, which is what you would call the green energy transition, is very much in India's context, at least, is a conversation about energy security. So when we talk
Yeah.
about energy transition, we look at three fundamental pillars of that. The first is the pillar of renewable energy. Do as much renewable energy as possible. The second is the broader pillar of efficiency. Be efficient in your energy use, get more output for the same amount of energy. And the third pillar is the electrification pillar, which is wherever possible, cut down fossil fuel use and convert it into electricity based processes, which is again much easier to decarbonize. And again, there's a lot more nuance there. A sub part of it is in some way also to shift away from fossil fuel to, let's say, biodegradable fuels, where again you are a lot more locally dependent, or within the boundaries of the country you're dependent. So if I were to look at these three fundamental pillars of energy transition, the renewable energy conversation is something that has been going on in India for a while, and there's been significant progress there. The efficiency conversation is also something that thankfully has now picked up, and there are a bunch of things happening in that direction. But when you look at the electrification conversation, when uh,
Hmm.
when we talk about electrification, there are, again, if I were to simplify it, there are broadly two aspects to electrification. One is the entire transport sector electrification, so the entire automobile sector going towards electric vehicles. That is one kind of electrification that we are seeing, be it for two wheelers, three wheelers, four wheelers, even for heavy vehicles right now. So that is one part of the electrification story. But the other very important part of the electrification story is the industrial electrification. So a very substantial part of the energy consumption in the country is done in industries, right from, examples of what you took, the Morbi tile example, but for wide variety of applications in manufacturing. So steam boilers, heating requirements, for core manufacturing in, let's say, cement, steel sector, etc. So that is something that historically is not a very mainstream conversation. But what this incident did is that really bring a lot more focus to the electrification story. So I wouldn't say that it can completely overnight change industries to rethink their processes, especially when it comes to, let's say, high temperature processes. So electrification also, the when it comes to industrial electrification, you have some processes which are simpler to electrify. So let's say processes which are generally up to 300, 400 degree temperatures. which often are there in the textile industry, in certain parts of manufacturing, especially in the auto supply chain, etc. A lot of these processes happen within the 300, 400 degree centigrade mark, even something as simple as a paint shop. So, in
Hmm.
that part of the ecosystem, I think what the current crisis has done is really accelerate the transition. So as Mahindra, we had been doing a number of things in this area for a long while. So some of it started paying off in a different way. So these were being done primarily for sustainability reasons. As I said, that once you are able to electrify a heat based process, then it's much easier to decarbonize versus decarbonizing from other formats. So that is the reason we were doing this historically, a few of these things. But now with the energy crisis, you basically started having another business case. So not just only for sustainability reasons, but also for business continuity reasons. It was a way to build resilience both in your own operations, but also in your supply chain operations. So that was the second aspect. The third
Hmm.
benefit to this transition, what it's doing is that it also protects you in the mid to long term from price volatility. So
Yeah.
again, going to the same point I made earlier, when it comes to electricity, we generate it largely within the country, and as a result, you have way high predictability on electricity pricing. So over a period of time, say in 2026, you can sign contracts which will give you electricity pricing for a fixed price 10 years down the line. So you can predict your electricity pricing for a fairly long period of time. You can decarbonize it. You can set up your solar plants, wind plants, XYZ. There's a lot that you can do to have control over that, unlike fuel pricing. So that was the other thing that slowly there is realization that fuel volatility is there and it's always going to be there. And if you were to
Yeah.
generally look at a trend over a period of time, it's only going to become more expensive. It's not going to get cheaper. So from
Hmm.
that aspect, I think along with the sustainability case, a very strong business continuity and a very strong economic case has now emerged, or now is being well understood, I would say. And as a result, we have seen a lot more happening in the electrification side of things. Both within our group, where we were doing a few things, we now are doing a lot more things. But also, I think externally in the ecosystem is where I see that that is a trend that has really picked up. People are talking about process heat, people are talking about heat pumps, people are talking about electric boilers. Obviously, there's the biofuel story as well, which is not exactly electrification, but somewhat in that
Yeah.
direction on, how do you do more, relatively more renewable fuel sourcing, etc. So I think that is one very, very big transition. The other big transition, which again is a more medium term play out, is coming back to the transport electrification. So transport electrification also is something that as a country we have definitely been investing in it. As a company we have been investing in it very heavily. But there also, I think, with the fuel prices sort of inching northwards, and this did not happen overnight, and this is happening over a period of time, but anyone can sort of see that this is something that will generally keep going northward. So you don't at least in the country, expect fuel prices will go down even over a
Hmm.
long period of time. Whether the volatility remains or other forms of volatility will come in the ecosystem. So it
Hmm.
just makes a lot more logical sense to push for accelerated transport electrification as well. So there again, we are seeing that a number of initiatives are being taken both within the government ecosystem, but also I think in the commercial or private ecosystem at an individual level. Just yesterday or day before yesterday, I believe there's a scheme that has been launched for Delhi to tackle air pollution, but a lot of it also solves the electrification problem for transport sector. There have been various other circulars, guidelines, etc., which are encouraging the government ecosystem to now start purchasing electric vehicles, but with more stronger rigor. So we see that the transport electrification story is the other thing that will only accelerate because of this crisis, which is why I think I'll maybe take a pause here. But there are short term impacts which you have to tactically manage them, solve them, try to reduce whatever effects happen. But the bigger conversation that we should really focus on is what is the long term trend that is coming out of this crisis. And it is very clear, it's energy transition. It's in what is good for the environment is good for the country, both from an economic standpoint and from a security standpoint. Let me pause
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Ankit. And actually, that's a great starting point, right? Like I think how you just neatly broke down the energy transition across renewables and then efficiency and then electrification. And you did speak at length about the electrification piece broken down by industry as well as transport. Can you also tell us a little bit about the efficiency piece, right? Because I think and this and because renewable story also, that I think that's something that we hear a lot about, especially in the news. The government has lots of states have their own policies around it, and India has had a great growth in terms of this number, right? However, this efficiency element, could you tell us a little bit more about that pillar?
So I think historically, whenever we have seen the macroeconomic story for any country, we typically correlate energy consumption, both overall energy consumption as well as per capita energy consumption, as a key determinant factor for GDP growth or economic growth. That has historically been a very strong correlation. You will generally find very high correlation between energy consumption of a country and its economic growth,
Yeah.
which over a period of time does make sense. But if you were to really look into the future, now increasingly we are trying to do or get the same economic output, and not just the economic output, I would keep inflation aside, the same volumetric output at lower the amount of energy. That is also
Hmm.
something that increasingly is something that companies and industry, especially in the manufacturing sector, in construction sector, etc., are focusing on. I will give you some specific data around this, that over a period of time we track something called the energy efficiency of manufacturing for our
Hmm.
businesses, especially in our auto farm sector, etc., where we see that what amount of energy is required to build one car, and that in a 10-year time frame or so has gone down by more than 50%. So you are able to make the same car at half the amount of energy. Now you would ask how. So there are
Hmm.
again very similarly three broad principles that you follow when it comes to energy efficiency. The first action is replacement of equipment with more energy efficiency equipment. So as time progresses, we are seeing a lot of new technology. Very simply put, we had incandescent bulbs going to
Hmm.
LED lights. We had three-star ACs going to five-star ACs and them becoming more efficient. We similarly have seen these BLDC fans as an example. So these are very simple examples, more everyday life, but the same argument for industrial scale machinery. You see a lot more efficient equipment and machinery that is coming, more efficient technology that is coming. So that is one, continuous investments in technology to replace with more energy efficient equipment. So that's one principle. The second principle is what is to avoid wastage. So again,
Hmm.
in a very simple personal setup, you would be like, you get out of the room, switch off the light. But the same
Hmm.
concept, when you apply it at industrial scale, in any industrial processes, there are many kinds of machinery which sometimes run either at over capacity, or it's being run when you don't need it to run. So either
Hmm.
because the power is much higher than what is required, or it's running for a much longer duration than what is required,
Hmm.
and so on. So there again, more at a process by process level, you can optimize for this. The right
Hmm.
sizing of the equipment, variable frequency drives which consume power only based on requirement, etc., switch off equipment when it's not needed. So both wastage, which is individual in nature but also systematic in nature, how do you cut down wastage of energy in your entire process? So that's the
Hmm.
second principle. Things like what I would consider is also insulation, etc. So if you are using let's say energy in a heat process, so if you were to insulate the entire ecosystem better, you will again save on electricity. Same goes for air conditioning. If you're cooling a process or cooling an environment, if you do better insulation, you'll save on cooling expenditure or cooling energy use. Same, let's say, goes also for computing. In the digital
Hmm.
ecosystem, how do you optimize for energy use? So that's the second principle, that how do you avoid wastage and use better equipment. The third principle is process re-engineering. What I mean by that is sometimes you can just rethink a industrial process in terms of either, I wouldn't say skipping steps, but optimizing steps to use less energy. Very simple example I'll give you. Let's say Generally, a car, when it's painted, it goes through a oven. Now, whether you keep it for 10 minutes or 8 minutes can still lead to the same outcome.
Hmm.
But you'll save 20% on your energy cost. So I'm
Hmm.
just taking a very simplified
Yeah.
example, but the idea is to again optimize at a process level. So these three principles: use efficient equipment, avoid wastage, optimize your processes. So that's the thing. The only challenge with energy efficiency is that unlike renewables, you can't do one big project that will solve everything. So energy
Right.
efficiency is a lot more about a lot of smaller things. So it's not one mega investment, it's not one big project. It's extremely contextual. It has to be, more like some of the equipment replacement, etc. You can still do at scale, but a lot of it has to be highly contextualized to the specific process, through the specific equipment, etc. So, again, to give a very real example, we are doing roughly about 300 to 350 projects every year in the factories around energy efficiency. So these are all not individually, they may not amount to much, but at an aggregate level, they create a lot more impact, and it's building that culture around it. A lot of it has to come ground up. Uh, so the results are basically, again, one of those areas where environmental outcomes and economic outcomes go together. Generally speaking, most of these interventions around energy efficiency are either uh, at almost no cost, or at the kind of capex investments or opex investments which will get recovered in between 2 to 3 years. So it's
Hmm.
more of a bottom up culture change of multiple small things that help drive energy efficiency in the manufacturing ecosystem. I'll maybe take a quick minute to just talk about the uh, you know uh, real estate ecosystem as well. So in the real estate
Hmm.
ecosystem, also some of these principles can be applied there, but the concepts are a bit different in the sense that we also make real estate in our real estate business, Mahindra Life Spaces. So you design for something called climate responsive design, which is effectively to say that how do you design a building that it requires less energy. So, more use of natural light, design in a manner that the cooling inside temperatures are better or better managed so that you don't have to spend more on cooling, etc. So there is some elements in the design stage itself which will cut down your energy use. And then subsequently, as you move on, you again solve for better equipment wherever possible in those kind of things. So that's broadly, an area which again often gets lost because it's not mega projects. It's often small things. But let me pause there.
Got it. Yeah, super helpful. And right now, Ankit, you I think if we break down perhaps the entire ecosystem, say production, then the organization, and then consumption, right? I would now like to take up the consumption element, right? And again, let's talk about the B2C element, right? Tell us a little bit about what is the Indian consumer's mindset towards sustainability, right? And what are certain elements that they really care about, right? And of course, perhaps maybe happy to think through some examples that how you have perhaps executed and whatever, sometimes even executed and misunderstood and hence failed, right? So we'd love to hear all of those examples.
No, absolutely. I think when it comes to the Indian consumer, one has to understand, and I at least am of a very strong view there, that consumers want to generally do the right thing, but often there are very few places where they have discretionary power. And I'll give you a very specific example to illustrate that point. I go and stay in hotels wherever I'm traveling. Now, whether the hotel gives me a plastic bottle, or whether it gives me a glass bottle, or it gives me a tap with filtered water that I can drink, that is something that the hotel determines. As a customer, I definitely would want to make a sustainable choice, but at times I don't always have that discretion. So I think across sectors, and this is obviously can't be generalized everywhere all the time, but in a lot of places, I think while customers care, but they may not always have the discretion. It can't be the core purchasing criteria in some cases. So let's say again, when you are buying a home, you have to solve for five other things before you can think about sustainability in the home. So the way I look at it is that it's a lot more, it's more the companies that need to take responsibility to drive these changes is one point I'm trying to make. The second point I would make is that also the depth of understanding. I think the customer generally will look at more outcome metrics, which are often also more optics. So again, to give an example, let's say I go to a hotel, whether the hotel uses a plastic bottle or a glass bottle is something I can see. It's a more
Hmm.
visual thing that I will interact with, and hence I will form an opinion on, okay, this is a sustainable hotel. They are using a glass bottle, avoiding plastic, and so on. But if I were to really think about it, the energy use of that property, whether it's coming from 100% renewable energy or is it coming from whatever the grid, etc., that is something that has a much higher overall environmental footprint impact of my decision. So if I were to,
Hmm.
choose between two hotels, the plastic bottle is still a very small component. The energy use of the property and how they manage water, etc., is a much bigger component of that conversation. But as a
Hmm.
customer, not everyone will have that understanding or discretion. I work in this space, so I know what to look for or what not to look for. A lot of other people understand that, who are probably part of this conversation today, but your average customer does not has that level of discretion. As a result, they end up talking or being swayed by more optics rather than substance. So I think that's the
Hmm.
two starting point. I do want to put it out there that ultimately it's the companies that will determine what is the right thing to do and how much they can do. The third is, I think, also there historically has been a bit of a trend around the world, maybe not as much in India yet, uh, is to say that green is premium. So anything green, sustainable comes at a premium, which is the other thing that we really need to change. Uh, the reason I say that is a lot of things which are green. In fact, I can safely say between 50 to 60% solutions around climate and sustainability today make economic sense for the manufacturer, for the seller. So how do you how do you ensure that you are either sharing these benefits with the customer, or if not sharing, at least sell the same thing at price parity. Now in
Hmm.
some cases you can look at it as a way to gain market share. So if today's customer around the world, and a majority of customers, if you give them like to like products at like to like pricing and tell them one is a more sustainable product versus the other, in majority of the cases they will go for the sustainable product given price parity. So the way
Hmm.
to think about it is that instead of looking at consumers and extract more from sustainability, look at it as a means to gain market share. So I believe some of these trends have to come from companies. So this is, I'm just giving you more conceptual points around how to think about the subject of customer interaction. In reality, I will take two examples, one from, let's say, the auto industry again, and one from the real estate industry. So in the auto industry, if you were to contrast the three-wheeler versus the four-wheeler EV penetration story, you see that the three-wheeler penetration story has been much better or more accelerated already. So we see a very, very major shift that has happened towards electric three-wheelers, primarily because the economic outcomes for the consumer is now strongly in favor for electric vehicles. So electric vehicle today in the Indian context is much cheaper to drive, and its overall total cost of ownership over its lifetime, right from the time of purchase to its operational cost, overall is now significantly, and when I say significantly, between 20 to 30%, depending on where you compare and other assumptions, is cheaper than your either a diesel or even a CNG vehicle for that matter. So you see that transition is happening very, very fast. But if I were to take the same argument for the four wheelers, in the four wheeler ecosystem, we still see electric vehicles in the more premium category so far. So as a
Hmm.
result, the penetration is slowly moving there. Depending on the use case, for some people, it's now becoming economically viable. But as economic viability and sustainability go hand in hand, that's when you see industries completely transforming. And I often take the three-wheeler example to illustrate this, that just about 5 to 6 years back, EV three-wheeler was single digit, low single digit, or almost negligible. 5 years from now, are saying that we'll be almost 100% electric three-wheeler.
Hmm.
So in just about a decade, you are completely transforming the industry from being non-sustainable to a sustainable product. And I'm talking about a mass scale industry across the country only because the economics started working. So the consumer shift will happen when the economics start favoring, or at least is at parity. So that's something that we'll see. I'll jump to the construction industry. In the construction industry, we tried doing something similar, which is tried to do these green buildings or net zero housing, etc.
Hmm.
So there, as I was saying, that the key purchasing criteria for a customer, unfortunately, in the real estate sector are multiple other things. Price of the
Hmm.
house, configuration, area, geography, builder, trust. There are 5 to 10 other parameters which are crucial when it comes to a customer making these decisions. So while people appreciate a greenhouse or a sustainable house or a sustainable construction, it is not meaningful enough yet to sway the decision in all contexts. So in again, like to like, if you have two choices, people will go for this, but it's not become a key purchasing criteria. But I think for simpler products like FMCG, etc., these are increasingly becoming key criteria for purchase, as long as you're not trying to sell at a premium. Let me pause there again.
Yeah, and Ankit, how about do you see any differences across the globe with certain, and perhaps maybe we can think about consumers across certain developed markets or other developing markets such as India?
Oh, absolutely, there is definitely a lot more differences. I will take two examples in particular. I was in Denmark last year, sometime early last year. So the Scandinavian ecosystem is the most mature ecosystem around the world when it comes to sustainability. So in pretty much every part of interaction, as a tourist in that ecosystem, I could see that right from hotels to supermarkets to anything and everything that you were interacting with in the external ecosystem, there was a color of sustainability everywhere. So the consumer there is a lot more mature, understanding, and they are also in some. I think it's reached a stage where this is pretty much hygiene. So it's actually difficult
Hmm.
to differentiate because everyone's doing it. So people are
Hmm.
really going out of their way to show how they are more differentiated, but the consumer understanding and awareness both is very very high. So that is one market, but I also will take a more recent example. I was in Singapore a couple of weeks back for Ecosperity. So there again, there were a bunch of things I picked up. One example, I'll take the Uber or the Grab there. On the cabs, while you did not see electric vehicles per se, but there was an option to offset your carbon footprint by paying a small
Hmm.
premium. Now, the fact that that option exists means there are people who are using it. Perhaps not everyone, but their consciousness is there. There are some people who are willing to do that. In the Indian market, if I have a choice on Uber for, let's say, electric cab versus a normal cab, I go for an electric cab wherever possible. But I think the point I'm still trying to make is that the customers will support, but companies will have to take the ownership of both building awareness and also moving away from this mindset of selling everything at a premium. I think the understanding has to be look at this as marketing to gain market share. You can do a lot more if you change the mindset on how to think about sustainability in the B2C ecosystem. B2B is different, but
Hmm.
B2C ecosystem.
Yeah. And Ankit, I think talking a little bit more about the B2B element, right? Today there are so many technologies out there, right? I think we have solar and I think multiple types. You can do PPA, captive, open access, etc. Right? I think now we also see a lot of our own customers adopting bio CNG and other similar solutions. Right? You talked about energy efficiency a fair bit as well. Is there any segment where you wish a solution existed?
Sorry, so when you ask a segment, as in, you mean like a
I
specific
think,
industry? So,
yeah, it could be an industry or it could be a technology, right? That I think anything is fine. Yeah.
oh, absolutely. See, the way I look at it is that, sustainability alone will not scale. or rather, environmentally good things alone will not scale. Environmentally good things with commercial viability are things with scale. So, for instance, generally speaking, there's a very good report that talks about is that when it comes to decarbonization solutions, there are about 50 to 60% of the solutions today which have reached commercial scale maturity. So,
Hmm.
when I talk about renewable energy, let's say the journey from 0 to 50% or 0 to 70% is also commercially viable in most use cases. But the last 70 to 100% is where sometimes it comes at a premium. Battery storage, 24/7,
Hmm.
round the clock power, etc. So I think we need solutions which will start making these commercially viable. So as cost of batteries continue to fall down, you will realize that over a period of time, maybe even 100% RE will become commercially viable over conventional
Hmm.
power. Similarly, if we were to talk about electric vehicles, same example, three-wheelers have crossed that threshold. Four-wheelers are somewhere in that journey. So the moment it crosses that threshold by a good margin, you will suddenly see that penetration will tick up. I will take examples of certain what are slightly harder to abate sectors as well. So let's say cement. As an
Hmm.
example, or concrete as a whole, and same goes for steel, aluminium, etc. There also, you have not reached a stage where low emission steel, low emission concrete, etc., can be scaled very fast. So it will take a while. It will take a while for it to scale. So I think it's really about uh, identifying sector by sector what needs commercial viability for it to scale. Now, commercial viability typically happens because of two reasons. Either you have innovation, which brings down the cost of something, or the second thing that typically happens is regulation. Most of environmental impact, the reason it is cheaper to, carry on the way we carry on is because you have externalized the cost. You don't pay for pollution, you don't pay for the
Hmm.
environmental impact, and as a result it's cheaper to use fossil fuel. The moment you
Hmm.
have regulation which forces you to internalize some of these costs, automatically the sustainable solution starts making sense. So I think it's a
Hmm.
mix of innovation and regulation, both or one of the two depending on context, is what makes each new solution viable. And once it becomes viable, it automatically, capitalism solves for it to scale.
Got it. So I was just asking that India has seen great success when it comes to renewables, right? But our discoms have struggled to keep up, right? Does that impact you or corporate India in general on a day-to-day basis?
No, absolutely. I wouldn't say it impacts us on a day-to-day basis, but all of us, at least the mature companies in the ecosystem working on sustainability, all of us are at least trying to move towards one goal, which is 100% renewable electricity in our operations. That is one of the biggest ways in which you can cut your direct footprint, and not just in your operations, but also in your supply chain. So there, I think while there have been a lot of positive regulations, especially at the central level and then also selectively at multiple states level, which allow companies to move forward on this journey, but it's not a 0-1 thing. So there are still a lot of challenges at a nitty-gritty level, depending on the kind of infrastructure, kind of requirements, etc., which means that you can't really get to 100% RE very quickly or very easily. You may do
Hmm.
some bits of it relatively easily in a commercially viable manner, but a lot of it is much harder. And as a result, whatever you buy from the grid right now, which is often a big part, especially for businesses which have more spread out domestic presence, such as, let's say, a financial institute which has 1,500 offices around the country, a
Hmm.
bank, NBFC, or any sort of service-based industries which don't have hardcore manufacturing, operate out of leased premises, etc. There, it becomes much harder for you to decarbonize because you are ultimately reliant on the grid. And the grid in
Hmm.
India is still roughly 75%, 73, 74%, fossil fuel powered. So the sooner
Hmm.
we move towards a decarbonized grid, the better it is. Again, we have some targets in terms of
Hmm.
capacity, etc. But we also need outcome targets. So currently, we are focusing on what I would call input metrics, which is capacity added and percentage of capacity which is renewable, etc. But at the end of the day, we need to look at outcome metrics that for every 100 units of electricity being consumed by the grid, how much of it is renewable? How quickly do we start changing the mix. So that I think is one important conversation. The other thing I would, more specific to the industry that we operate in. So let's say in the auto industry, the biggest conversation is of decarbonization for the auto industry is moving towards electric vehicles. Now, when it
Hmm.
comes to electric vehicles, also at the end of the day, a wide majority of consumers are charging it at their homes or let's say in commercial parks, etc. But most of the electricity is coming from the grid. So while
Hmm.
you have an electric vehicle, but a majority of the electricity still comes from a fossil fuel powered source. So that
Hmm.
effect needs can the environmental effect of it will get compounded once you are able to transition the grid. So I think the grid transition to becoming more sustainable is definitely one of the biggest priorities that we should have as a country. And as I said, it also helps you with your energy security. And from a cost perspective, also today, renewable power is definitely cheaper than
Hmm.
conventional power for at least new assets. And you see that happening. I think generally speaking, for India, 90-95% of all new assets are renewable. It's just that are we moving at the right pace? I think we are moving in the right direction, but we really need to do even more, even faster.
Hmm. Got it. And Ankit, actually, Atul Dheer has a very interesting question here as well, right? And I'll rephrase it a little bit, but from your corporate perspective, how do you anticipate the potential super El Nino impact on the country, perhaps, right? And today, for you on ground, what kind of decisions are you taking in regard to this? What changes are you seeing?
Sorry, changes in
The
terms of.
the the super the El Nino
Oh,
impact, yeah.
yes. Okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
got it. So again, when it comes to climate, like it's good that this question got asked because I think it's going to make me talk about my favorite topic these days, which is the adaptation conversation. So far, whatever we have spoken about is largely on the mitigation side of things. The energy transition is a mitigation story, but a very important climate conversation is also the adaptation story. We are already seeing climate change happen and the impacts of climate change. Both as a country, we are, geographically situated, and the kind of workforce and economic, per capita incomes we have makes us a lot more vulnerable to climate change. So, at least some global ranking tells us that we are the
Hmm.
sixth or seventh most vulnerable country when it comes to climate risk. Now, things like the El Nino, etc., only sort of make these effects more stronger in certain years. So if I were
Hmm.
to talk about it currently from a climate risk perspective, India has two very strong dependencies. One is on heat stress, or rather, one of the biggest risks that we face is heat stress. So, across the
Hmm.
country, over the last couple of months or so, we have seen numerous examples of how cities are breaching temperature marks, records, etc. But it has a very, very real human impact on operational impact, etc. In terms of both from an empathy point of view, but also from a purely economic and commercial point of view. Labor productivity gets impacted. There's risk to machinery and equipment. There is risk to productivity overall in the ecosystem around some of these things related to heat stress. So that is one big conversation. The other is the water conversation. So we as a country are still dependent on rainfall for a large part of our agriculture ecosystem. So that also gets impacted. So both the heat stress adaptation and mitigation and the food conversation, the farmer food conversation with respect to climate change are two very, very important conversations. So again, from a Mahindra point of view, this is definitely one of the strategic areas that we are working on the heat stress side, right from capability building, awareness building, solving for the governance around it. In fact, also putting together practices in place on how do we address it. I'm not at all claiming that we have done everything. We are
Hmm.
This is a work in progress topic. So coincidentally, just today on our main page on LinkedIn, we released a report that we were working on this issue and the severity of the issue around heat stress. And similarly,
Hmm.
when it comes to the farmer side of the ecosystem, as a company, a big part of the Mahindra Group is our tractor and agri business. We are one of the
Hmm.
largest tractor manufacturers in the world. Now, the simple point I make is that if farmers don't make money, you will not sell tractors. So,
Hmm.
protecting the farming ecosystem and the farm economy from climate risk is definitely something that is, good for business. So, there again,
Hmm.
there are a wide variety of interventions that we are taking, both through CSR but also through core business offerings that can help better prepare the farmer community to deal with this. So again, I don't believe we can solve both these problems in 1 year. So incidences like the El Nino, etc., are just reminders that these problems will only become much more severe over a period of time. So the more we do, both at a government level but at a private level as well, to take these topics seriously and start addressing this, it'll help us in the both in the short term and long term. Now I think it's no longer, we have passed the stage where we can look at these things as a long term problem only. I think these are now slowly becoming very much, today's problem rather than tomorrow's problem. So climate adaptation is where I would generally focus on, along with the energy transition work.
Hmm. And I actually would love to dive deeper into that, right? So when you talk about climate adaptation, you mentioned, of course, heat stress, right? And within heat stress as well, what you are doing on ground today is the capacity building, governance around it, right? Then you also talked about certain initiatives you've perhaps executed on the agriculture side of things. We'd actually love to hear some more examples across multiple sectors, like perhaps maybe starting with agriculture, but also construction, real estate. I mean, is there an adaptation? I mean, what does climate adaptation mean for hospitality and for certain other sectors?
So absolutely, the climate adaptation story is very relevant for pretty much all sectors. I think the way it
Hmm.
plays out is very different for each sector. So, agriculture, if I were to take an example, as I said, there are generally 4 or 5 things that get impacted because of climate change. So we think of rainfall as one example, but soil quality and moisture is another thing that gets impacted. The temperature obviously gets impacted. The seasonality changes, when rains start, etc., which changes the time of the crop. Even the pests and the insects that impact crop changes because of temperature and climate. So all of these factors that determine the yield or quality of a crop are getting impacted. So how do you prepare yourselves better? And there is a whole body of solutions, so which help you do that. So right from, the seeds that you apply, the farming method that you use, the kind of agriculture input that you give, the water management systems that you have. So literally every part of the crop cycle will have to be changed or evolved to deal with climate related stress. So which is something that some of the parts is where we are doing something. So we have a business for drip irrigation, which is a good solution for water adaptation. We have businesses which sell seeds especially for rice, and also a few other things including potato and vegetables, etc. So there we are selling new variants which are more climate resilient, use less water for growing. In our manufacturing businesses, which we are trying to promote, methods of rice farming which are more sustainable in nature, something called alternate wetting and drying, and direct seeding of rice, etc. So there are a bunch of things. Also, generally coaching and training farmers around adopting some of these regenerative agricultural practices, sustainable agricultural practices, from the CSR side as well. So these are a few interventions that you are taking to help with this as one, let's say, big bucket. The second thing that I would, maybe take another example. Let's say talk about the resorts business for a change. So we have a resorts business now. People go to a resort when they want to have a good time, but if you go
Hmm.
to a resort which is, in a place where it's 45 degrees, then you generally will not be very comfortable or would want to. And these are not exactly city hotels. These are resorts which have open spaces. You go with family. You want to spend time in the open. That's the very intent of going to these places away from city life. So, if the local environment there is so inhospitable because of the temperature, etc., then for a lot of months you'll lose revenue. So, how do you invest to protect that local environment to make it a lot more palatable? I was again traveling. I end up. Going to different parts very often. So, traveling in was in in Goa a couple of weeks back. So similar experience that it was so hot that you just could not step out of your room. You were bound to your meeting room and your hotel room for the entire duration. So I think these are some things that impact customer experience. If I were to again look at let's say the solar industry as an example. So we also have a sizable presence in the solar ecosystem. There, uh, heat stress is a major issue because the kind of regions where you have these mega solar parks are already hot, are generally more
Hmm.
dry, arid deserts, etc. So in that ecosystem, heat stress is becoming a major problem. You have to stop work for a fairly substantial part of the day. You can only work either in the mornings or in the late evenings. Your productivity gets impacted, your operations get impacted. So there are definitely a lot of these climate risks which are playing out in different parts of the ecosystem. The only challenge is that we are still in early days of understanding the actual impact. You may not always have clear numbers, or it's not always possible to articulate or mathematically show the exact impact. So we are still in early days of doing that, but anecdotally, based on a lot of interviews that we did across the ecosystem, we are seeing these impacts play out. uh, who absorbs this impact is also another question. Sometimes, the impact is being absorbed by the individual who's working, and very often,
Hmm.
in fact, is being absorbed by the. In some cases, it obviously translates to the company, to the business, to the safety and the operational efficiency of this. But irrespective, I think these are important issues to understand and address, which is something that we are trying to drive both internally and externally, but still early days for India on these.
Yeah. And I think again here, would any global, I mean, just would love to add the global perspective here as well, right? I mean, I myself live in Dubai, right? And of course, it does get very, very hot, but I think the because it's a newer city slash country compared to India, perhaps the infrastructure has been built keeping this in mind, right? And again, the industry is very, very different, right? So, would love to hear more about any certain examples of any countries that have like again, let's maybe Europe has its own separate problems, and we all have a different adaptation story. But some more examples of countries similar to India, and perhaps they could be a little more advanced compared to us.
Um, I I I can't think of anyone who's like very mature on this subject. In fact, perhaps Middle East is among the better
Hmm.
examples when it comes to the
Hmm.
heat side of things, because
Hmm.
when you look at some of the other developed parts of the world, their problems are more on the cold side. Although Europe is also now currently grappling with what they
Yeah.
like to call a heat wave, we in India would not even call that a heat wave. So
Good
there they
weather.
have challenges in terms of,
Yeah.
because the infrastructure is not built for that. The infrastructure is built to retain heat, and as a result,
Yeah.
indoor temperatures, even though the temperatures outside are still in the 20 to 30-degree range, indoors become much hotter because you have not solved or built for that kind of infrastructure. So I think there are things that are happening globally, but I wouldn't necessarily say that anyone has been able to completely crack the problem. The adaptation problem is a relatively more new and forward looking problem that the world will face, or to some extent is facing, but will face a lot more of it in the future. I
Hmm.
can't think of any country level examples. There are obviously individual clusters or small
Hmm.
groups where some of these interventions have worked out. Especially I think again on the heat side, I'll generally look at Middle East, Australia as examples. Even within India, there are good examples of places where people have solved for the local environment. How can
Hmm.
you solve for the blue green environment at a local level, which makes the local temperature much better. I used to study in one of the colleges in Delhi, IIT Delhi. It had a huge campus, but even today I can safely say that the temperature inside the campus versus outside will be at least 3 to 5 degrees different. So you can solve for a few of these things in the local environment as well, but I think we need to address these things a bit more systematically over a period of time, because what we don't realize is that what has been the severity historically, the next few years are going to be much worse. So these are not areas
Yeah.
where you'll face the same problem every year. You will face the
Yeah.
magnitude of the problem is going to increase manyfold in the future,
Hmm.
and we are generally speaking not as well prepared on this.
Yeah, perfect. So, Ankit, yeah, it is 5 p.m.
Yes.
I have tried to incorporate, I got a couple questions in my personal chat. I've tried to incorporate all of that in my questions. And yes, I guess everyone's questions have been answered. I would suppose, but I got quite lost in the conversation that I did not pause. I'm sorry about that, everyone. But thank you so much for doing this, Ankit. I learned a lot about mitigation, adaptation, on-ground reality around production, culture, and consumption as well. And yes, I think for the participants, thank you so much for being such good listeners and for all your questions as well. In case any other question comes up, feel free to write to us, and we'd be happy to get Ankit's opinion on it, and we'll send it back to you. But yes, thank you everyone again, and hope you have a very, very wonderful rest of your day, rest of the week as well.